In the early hours of 21 October 1805, the waters off Cape Trafalgar roiled with a tension that had been building for months. Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, commanding a combined French and Spanish fleet, faced Admiral Horatio Nelson's seasoned squadron in what was expected to be a decisive clash for control of the seas. History remembers this day as a British triumph. Here we imagine the opposite. Villeneuve, having studied Nelson's aggressive tactics, ordered his ships into a tight line-ahead formation that allowed them to concentrate fire on the British vanguard. The French gunners, supplied with newly cast 24-pounder carronades, delivered a devastating barrage that shattered the center of Nelson's column. Within hours, the British flagship Victory was reduced to splinters, and the remaining vessels were forced into a disordered retreat. The defeat sent shockwaves through London. The Royal Navy, long regarded as the world's preeminent maritime force, suddenly found its dominance challenged. More importantly for Napoleon, the Channel, once an impregnable barrier, lay open to French transport ships. Villeneuve's fleet, though battered, retained enough cohesion to escort a convoy of troop carriers toward the English coast. The victory at Trafalgar did not merely alter a battle, it altered the strategic calculus of Europe. France now possessed the means to project power across the Channel, and Britain faced its first genuine threat of invasion since the Spanish Armada. Napoleon Bonaparte, crowned emperor in 1804, seized upon this unprecedented opportunity with characteristic speed. Within weeks, he ordered a massive amphibious operation that combined traditional landing craft with an experimental aerial component, balloons filled with hydrogen and equipped for reconnaissance. Though primitive by later standards, these dirigibles offered a view of the coastline that no longer required risky scouting parties to approach under fire. From the ports of Boulogne and Calais, thousands of seasoned infantry, veterans of Austerlitz and the Italian campaigns, embarked alongside engineers tasked with constructing temporary pontoon bridges. The French Navy, now emboldened by Villeneuve's success, ferried the troops across a sea that had seemed unassailable. On 7 November, under a grey sky, the first wave touched down near Dover. The landing was met not with the thunder of cannon fire, but with scattered musketry from coastal militia and an uneasy silence from the Royal Navy, still regrouping after its loss at Trafalgar. The French balloonists hovered above, relaying real-time observations to commanders on the ground. They reported weak points in the British field fortifications and the limited availability of artillery. With this intelligence, Napoleon ordered a rapid inland push toward the Thames, aiming to seize the capital before the British could organize a coherent defense. The march toward London was swift, but not without resistance. At Canterbury, local militia attempted a stand only to be outflanked by French cavalry that had already crossed the Channel. By 15 November, the road to the capital lay essentially open. Inside the city, Parliament convened in an atmosphere of panic. The House of Commons, still committed to the parliamentary system, debated whether to flee to the colonies or to negotiate a ceasefire. Napoleon's forces arrived at the outskirts of London on 20 November. The French army, disciplined and bolstered by the morale of recent victories, laid siege to the city with artillery positioned along the Thames embankments. British defenders, demoralized after losing their navy and faced with a superior land force, could offer only token resistance. After 3 days of bombardment, the walls of the City of London were breached. Faced with inevitable defeat, the Speaker of the House called for an emergency session in which Parliament voted to surrender its authority temporarily to avoid further bloodshed. Napoleon entered the city on 24 November, not as a conqueror bent on destruction, but as a ruler seeking legitimacy. He installed a provisional council composed of moderate British politicians and French administrators, promising to preserve English law while integrating it into the broader Napoleonic framework. The crown was left vacant. The monarchy, already weakened by war, receded into exile. With Britain's political heart subdued, Napoleon turned his attention eastward. The French Empire already controlled most of continental Europe through a combination of conquest and alliance. In early 1806, he extended the Napoleonic Code to the newly annexed territories of the former Holy Roman Empire, dissolving lingering monarchic structures in favor of a uniform civil law system. The German states that had previously formed the Confederation of the Rhine were reorganized into the Continental Confederation, a federation bound by French legal and administrative standards. Local princes either swore allegiance to Napoleon or were replaced by appointed governors loyal to Paris. Courts, schools, and tax systems were standardized. The French language became the lingua franca of bureaucracy, though local dialects persisted in daily life. This reordering was not merely bureaucratic, it represented a profound shift in European identity. The concept of sovereign nation-states gave way to a continent unified under a single legal framework, with Napoleon at its apex. While some traditional elites resisted, many merchants and professionals welcomed the stability that came with consistent law across borders, a stark contrast to the patchwork of feudal jurisdictions that had previously hampered trade. Amidst this continental transformation, the Irish Republican Front, an emerging nationalist movement seeking independence from British rule, found a powerful ally in France. For decades, Irish rebels had looked to French support as a means of breaking the island's subjugation. With Britain's government displaced and its military capacity shattered, the French saw an opportunity to secure a strategic foothold on the western edge of the continent. In December 1806, French forces landed in Dublin under a flag of truce, meeting representatives of the Irish Front. Negotiations produced the Irish Accord. France would recognize an autonomous Irish Republic, granting it self-government and control over its own finances, while obliging the new state to provide troops for the Continental Confederation's defense. In return, French garrisons would protect Irish ports from any remaining royalist naval threats. The accord cemented a bond between Ireland and the Napoleonic system. Irish law was gradually harmonized with the code, but provisions were made to preserve certain cultural institutions, particularly those related to land tenure and religious practice. The arrangement gave the French Empire a valuable ally that could serve as a gateway for Atlantic trade, even as Britain's own maritime commerce languished. The capture of London and control over key British ports, including Liverpool, Bristol, and Newcastle, reoriented the flow of goods across the North Sea. French authorities redirected much of the raw material traffic toward continental shipyards and factories, accelerating industrial development in France, the German states, and Allied territories. Coal from northern England, once a cornerstone of Britain's own industrial revolution, now fed furnaces in Lille, Aachen, and the burgeoning steelworks of the Rhineland. Conversely, Britain's economy entered a period of stagnation. Deprived of its naval supremacy and cut off from its traditional markets, British merchants faced severe shortages of raw materials and lost access to continental customers. The continental system, which Napoleon had already begun enforcing in 1806, now found practical enforcement through French control of the Channel ports. Smuggling persisted, but the scale of illicit trade could not offset the broader economic decline. The shift was felt most acutely in the textile centers of Manchester and Birmingham, where factories saw reduced output due to lack of cotton imports from the colonies. Colonial goods themselves now routed through French-controlled Atlantic outposts. While Britain's industrial base remained technically advanced, its growth stalled, and many workers faced unemployment. The contrast between a rapidly modernizing continental Europe and a beleaguered British Isles became one of the defining features of this alternate 19th century. With the Western Front secured, Napoleon turned his gaze eastward toward Russia. Historically, the invasion of 1812 was hampered by Britain's naval blockade and the logistical nightmare of supplying an army across vast distances. In this timeline, however, the British threat had been neutralized. French control of the Channel freed up naval assets for transport and supply along the Baltic coast. In spring 1808, a massive French-German army crossed into Prussian lands and advanced toward the Polish frontier. The Russian Tsar, already weakened by internal dissent and the loss of potential British allies, faced an invasion from a direction he had not anticipated. Napoleon's forces moved swiftly, capturing key fortresses such as Königsberg and Riga before winter set in. The Russian campaign unfolded with brutal efficiency. French engineers repaired roads and built supply depots at a pace that outstripped the logistical failures of the historical 1812 march. While the harsh climate still exacted a toll, the lack of British interference allowed Napoleon to maintain a steady flow of provisions from the Continental Confederation's industrial heartland. By early 1809, Russian forces were forced into a negotiated settlement that ceded Western territories and placed a pro-French regime in St. Petersburg. The fall of Russia further cemented French dominance over Europe. No longer constrained by a coalition of hostile powers, Napoleon could focus on consolidating his empire rather than defending its borders. By 1810, the continent resembled a federation more than an empire. The Continental Confederation operated under a single legal code, a unified customs system, and a coordinated military command that answered to the emperor in Paris. Former monarchies existed only as ceremonial entities, their powers subsumed by elected councils that reported to the central authority. Britain, stripped of its parliamentary seat at Westminster and its global empire, retreated into exile. The remaining British Commonwealth colonial holdings in Canada, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa reorganized under a provisional government operating from Halifax. Isolated from Europe, these colonies pursued limited self-government while maintaining cultural ties to the motherland. Trade with the continent persisted through neutral ships, but the scale was a fraction of what it had been before 1805. The Irish Republic flourished as a semi-autonomous partner within the Federation, contributing troops and resources while enjoying internal governance. French influence spread into Ireland's legal and educational systems, yet the island retained its distinct identity, a testament to the pragmatic compromise forged in the wake of conquest. Life across the continent settled into a rhythm defined by centralized law, industrial growth, and relative peace enforced by the might of the French-German army. The specter of war lingered at the edges, still present in distant colonies and in the memory of those who had resisted, but the daily reality for most citizens was one of stability and progress under a single European order. In reflecting upon this divergent path, we are reminded how a single naval battle can ripple through history, reshaping nations, economies, and identities. The triumph at Trafalgar did not merely alter a fleet, it altered the destiny of an entire continent. As we look back from our present, the lesson remains clear. The balance of power rests on fragile foundations, and the tides of history turn on moments both grand and quiet.